The night air tore at Emily's lungs as she ran barefoot across the gravel, every jagged stone biting into her skin like teeth. Behind her, the shadows stretched long, carrying whispers that froze her blood. Emily said, "They're coming for me." The sound of her own voice was too loud, too alive, and she bit her lip until it bled. Somewhere far behind, Reverend Caleb's deep voice drifted like smoke, reciting a prayer that sounded more like a curse. Emily remembered when she believed those words were meant to heal. Tonight, they were shackles, chasing her down the road. A locked door slammed somewhere ahead, and she knew it was the barrier between freedom and endless obedience. Her heart pounded with a rhythm too sharp for silence, each beat screaming louder than her footsteps. Emily said, "I can't stop." She pushed forward, desperate, her breath ragged, tasting metal and fear. Gravel slipped beneath her, but she dared not look back. To look back was to be swallowed by devotion, turned into chains, prayers turned into weapons, and love twisted into control. Emily pressed herself against the wooden fence, splinters biting her palms, her breath shallow and uneven. The night smelled of ash and damp earth. She thought of Sarah, her younger sister, left behind in the dormitory. Emily said, "I can't leave her, but I can't go back." The prayers echoed louder now, rhythmic and cruel, filling the air like chains tightening. She remembered the night Sarah whispered, "Do you think God hears us?" Emily had no answer then, and none now. Her heartbeat thudded against the wood, each beat a question: run or return. Somewhere beyond the fence was freedom, but beyond her hesitation was Sarah's face, still waiting for rescue, still believing the words of Reverend Caleb. Emily's chest shook with the weight of the choice. She said, "Please, forgive me," though she wasn't sure to whom the words were spoken, her sister, herself, or the silent stars above. The gravel path ended in shadows where the dormitory loomed like a prison. Emily remembered its narrow windows, barred like eyes that never blinked. She whispered to herself, "That place is a cage." Yet her thoughts went to Sarah, small and trusting, still inside those walls. Emily closed her eyes and saw the nightly prayers, everyone kneeling, voices blending into a single chant. Reverend Caleb's voice always thundered above theirs, promising salvation but delivering silence. Emily said, "They don't save us, they bury us." The air felt heavy, pressing on her chest as though even the night wanted her to kneel. She clenched her fists, gravel dust sticking to the blood on her skin. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but another voice whispered that leaving meant abandoning Sarah to the chains Emily herself could no longer bear. The sound of footsteps broke the night, heavy and deliberate. Emily froze, every muscle screaming for silence. Jonathan's figure appeared through the mist, tall and unyielding, torch casting cruel shadows across his face. Jonathan said, "You cannot run, Emily." His voice was calm, almost pitying, but his eyes burned with obedience. Emily's lips trembled, yet she forced herself to speak. Emily said, "I won't go back." The torch crackled between them, painting her face in gold and fear. Jonathan's jaw tightened as though her defiance hurt him more than it angered him. For a heartbeat, silence stretched, broken only by her ragged breathing. Then his steps resumed, slow and certain, the torchlight edging closer. Emily darted sideways into the forest, branches whipping her arms, the ground uneven but merciful compared to the gravel. She said, "Run, just run." Behind her, Jonathan's torchlight flickered, relentless, following through the trees. The prayers grew louder, voices overlapping like a swarm. Emily remembered the locked door slamming earlier and realized it was meant to keep her in, not out. Her chest heaved as she stumbled over roots, mud soaking her dress. The forest smelled of wet soil and fear. She whispered, "Sarah, forgive me." For every step forward, the past clung tighter, but the forest path held a fragile promise of escape, if only she could reach it before the shadows swallowed her whole. Emily leaned against a tree, chest heaving, as the forest swallowed the sounds of pursuit. Her mind drifted backward to when she first arrived at the compound. She was 17 then, fragile and lost, desperate for somewhere to belong. Reverend Caleb's words had wrapped around her like a warm cloak, promising peace where the world had only given pain. Emily said, "I thought he was saving me." She remembered Sarah's laughter when they were younger, the way her sister clung to her hand as if Emily could shield her from the storms of life. At the compound, that laughter had been stolen, replaced by endless chanting. Emily said, "We just wanted to be loved." She closed her eyes, feeling the echo of longing that had once kept her kneeling. It was not weakness that bound her but the hope of family, a hope now twisted into chains. Emily remembered the first night she and Sarah slept inside the dormitory. The air smelled of dust and old wood, and the windows were barred even then. Sarah had whispered, "At least we're safe now." Emily smiled through her own doubts, clutching Sarah's hand until both drifted into uneasy sleep. Reverend Caleb's voice had greeted them at dawn, rising with the sun like a hymn. He spoke of family, salvation, and love unconditional. Emily said, "We wanted so badly to believe him." She remembered how Jonathan stood nearby, watching with unflinching eyes, already remade by loyalty. She thought of how the chants had grown familiar, shaping their days, dulling their fear. Emily said, "We traded freedom for belonging." Her chest tightened with guilt as the memory pressed against her like a cage. The mornings at the compound blurred together. Everyone woke before dawn, kneeling on rough floors until knees ached. Reverend Caleb walked among them, his robe sweeping like a dark tide. Emily said, "I believed his words then." She recalled Sarah's tired face, trying to keep her eyes open as prayers stretched on. The enforcer Jonathan stood like a statue, ensuring no one faltered. Emily said, "Even silence was a test." The rules seemed endless: how to eat, how to speak, when to smile. Every breath belonged to the cult. Yet in those first weeks, Emily felt purpose, as if her pain had finally been woven into meaning. She remembered telling herself that endurance was proof of devotion, not chains closing tighter. Emily's memories shifted to evenings when Reverend Caleb sat with them after supper. His voice softened, then weaving stories of salvation. Emily said, "He made us believe we were chosen." Sarah leaned against her, eyes shining with hope. Jonathan stood behind Caleb, silent and sharp, like a blade waiting to be used. Emily remembered his presence as both comforting and threatening, a reminder that loyalty had its guardians. She whispered now into the forest air. We wanted it to be true. The silent observer, Ruth, often lingered in shadows, her gaze flickering with secrets she dared not speak. Emily said, "Even then, I sensed cracks, but I pushed them away." The warmth of those evenings was a lie wrapped in tenderness. Emily recalled the night they were told to give up their names. Reverend Caleb declared, "You belong only to the light now." Emily had whispered her birth name to Sarah, clinging to it like a secret flame. Sarah said, "We can keep it between us." They shared a look that promised they would not forget who they were. Jonathan's gaze swept the room, catching Emily's hesitation. He said, "Obedience is freedom." The words sliced through her resolve, but Sarah's small hand squeezed hers in defiance. Emily whispered now, "That was the night we began to lose ourselves." It was the first step toward becoming shadows in Caleb's doctrine, and Emily felt the memory burn deeper than any wound. The bells rang at dawn, pulling everyone from their beds into the prayer hall. Emily's body felt heavy, her knees already aching before they touched the floor. Reverend Caleb's voice rose, deep and commanding, echoing through the wooden walls. Emily said, "We must obey." Sarah knelt beside her, too young for such weight, eyes tired but determined to mirror the others. Jonathan paced at the back, his boots thudding in rhythm with the chants. Emily remembered the first time she had faltered, when silence slipped from her lips. Jonathan's hand had fallen hard across her cheek, and Reverend Caleb had declared, "Discipline saves the soul." Emily said, "Fear became the hymn we sang." The walls of the hall pressed closer, suffocating every breath, every thought, until obedience was no longer choice but survival. At meals, silence was demanded. Wooden bowls scraped against tables as everyone ate in unison, heads bowed. Emily whispered once to Sarah, only to feel Jonathan's shadow loom over her. Jonathan said, "You know the rules." His voice was soft but sharp as a blade. Emily forced herself to swallow words like spoiled bread. Across the room, Ruth's eyes flickered toward them before dropping quickly to her bowl. Emily said, "Even kindness became dangerous." Reverend Caleb reminded them daily that every rule was sacred, that disobedience poisoned the whole flock. Emily thought of Sarah's trembling hands clutching the spoon, desperate not to spill. She said, "We lived afraid of every gesture." The silence around the table screamed louder than hunger. The punishments were designed to erase doubt. Emily remembered when a boy had refused to kneel, his legs trembling as he stood in defiance. Reverend Caleb's voice boomed, "Pride must be broken." Jonathan dragged him outside, and the crack of the whip silenced every breath. Emily said, "We all learned then that rebellion cost blood." Sarah clutched Emily's hand so tight her nails drew skin, eyes wide with terror. Ruth stood apart, unmoving, her face unreadable, but Emily saw the faint tremor in her lips. That night, the prayers were longer, voices trembling but louder, desperate to prove their loyalty. Emily said, "Fear stitched our mouths shut, but our hearts screamed louder than words we could not say." The rules grew heavier with each passing season. Women were told to cover their hair, to lower their gaze, to serve without question. Emily said, "Every thread of my dress felt like a chain." Sarah mimicked the motions, obedient, but Emily saw the spark in her sister's eyes dimming. Jonathan enforced every command without hesitation, his silence more terrifying than words. Reverend Caleb declared, "Submission is salvation." Ruth lingered at the edges, folding cloth, eyes haunted as if she carried too many secrets. Emily whispered to herself, "They wanted us to disappear." She remembered pressing her forehead to the cold floor, wishing she could vanish into dust rather than remain a vessel for their control. The chants became endless, morning and night, voices weaving into a net that strangled individuality. Emily said, "I lost the sound of my own voice." Reverend Caleb's tone cut through the air, always above the rest, commanding, unyielding. Sarah's voice wavered beside her, young and soft, trying to match the others. Jonathan walked the aisles like a sentinel, eyes scanning for weakness. Ruth stared at the ground, lips moving but eyes empty. Emily remembered how she once tried to change the words, whispering something different under her breath, only to feel Jonathan's hand grip her shoulder. Jonathan said, "Stay pure." The memory stung her even now. Emily whispered into the night, "They buried us beneath their prayers." The night air was thick as Emily crept back near the compound, drawn by a sound that wasn't prayer but laughter. She pressed her ear to the cracks in Caleb's chamber wall. Inside she heard him speaking, voice dripping with indulgence. Reverend Caleb said, "Their faith is my harvest." Emily's stomach twisted as the words shattered the illusion she once held sacred. He spoke of offerings not as holy sacrifices, but as wealth and power. Jonathan's voice rumbled low, steady in agreement. Jonathan said, "They fear you too much to question." Emily clutched her chest, breath shallow, realizing the prayers were never meant for God, but for control. She whispered to herself, "We were never saved." Emily's heart pounded as she saw through the gap Caleb holding gold coins, passing them into a chest. His fingers caressed them with more reverence than any prayer. Reverend Caleb said, "Their souls are cheap, but their obedience makes me rich." Jonathan stood silent, torchlight reflecting in his cold eyes. Emily's memory clashed against reality. The sermons of sacrifice were lies, the prayers only meant to bind. Sarah's hopeful face flashed in her mind, believing every word. Emily said, she must never know this truth. The weight of betrayal crushed her, sharper than any punishment she had endured. Her faith was broken, and with it, the cage began to crack. The next morning, Emily watched Sarah kneel in the hall, lips moving with devotion. Emily's chest burned with guilt, knowing the truth she carried. Sarah said, "One day we'll be free through faith." Emily forced a smile, but her heart screamed at the lie. Across the hall, Ruth's eyes caught hers, lingering with a look that suggested she too knew something was wrong. Emily said, "She sees it too." Reverend Caleb raised his arms high, voice thundering about purity and salvation. But all Emily could see were his hands counting gold in the dark. The room felt poisoned, every word dripping with falsehood. Emily whispered in her mind, "This is the prison built on our belief." That night, Emily approached Ruth by the well, the only place whispers might vanish into water. Emily said, "You know the truth, don't you?" Ruth flinched, her hands trembling as she lowered the bucket. Ruth whispered, "If you speak it, you'll die." Their eyes locked, silence weaving between fear and desperation. Emily thought of Sarah, her innocence chained to the same lie. She said, "I can't let her stay blind." Ruth shook her head, expression broken, but her silence became its own confession. Emily realized she wasn't alone in doubt, but Ruth's fear was a warning. Truth was a weapon, and wielding it could destroy them both. Emily returned to the dormitory, heart aching as Sarah slept peacefully, face bathed in soft candlelight. Emily touched her sister's hair gently, whispering, "You deserve more than lies." The betrayal of Reverend Caleb roared in her mind, louder than the chants. Jonathan's watchful presence lingered outside, his boots echoing on the ground. Emily realized escape would no longer just be about her survival. It was about breaking Sarah free from a world built on deceit. Emily whispered, "I won't let them bury you in prayers." Her tears fell silently, merging with the candle's wax, sealing a vow that the chains of devotion would no longer define their lives. The night was thick with silence when Emily shook Sarah awake, her heart hammering louder than the crickets outside. Emily whispered, "We have to leave now." Sarah blinked, confused, still caught in the haze of dreams. Emily pulled her close, eyes burning with urgency. The dormitory creaked as though it could betray them with every step. Outside, Jonathan's shadow paced, his torchlight sweeping across the window. Emily's hands trembled as she whispered again, "Please, trust me." Sarah's lips parted, frightened, but she nodded. The choice was no longer survival alone. It was rebellion. Emily said, "We either run tonight, or we never run at all." The air pressed against them heavy, every breath a risk, every movement the birth of defiance. Emily and Sarah slipped through the narrow gap in the fence, wood tearing at their clothes as the night opened wide before them. Sarah whispered, "Where do we go?" Emily's breath shook as she answered, "Anywhere but here." Behind them, footsteps grew louder, Jonathan's patrol breaking rhythm. The sisters froze, pressed against the earth, breath shallow. Emily's mind screamed with the memory of Caleb's words, obedience or ruin. She clenched her fist around Sarah's hand and said, "Not this time." The torchlight swept closer, a predator's eye searching the darkness. Emily's pulse matched Sarah's, two hearts beating one rhythm of defiance. The forest swallowed them as they ran, branches tearing at their arms, roots clawing at their feet. Behind, Jonathan's voice thundered, "You cannot hide." His words carried the weight of Caleb's power, but Emily pressed forward, dragging Sarah with her. Sarah cried, "I'm scared." Emily said, "So am I, but fear won't stop us." Every breath burned, every step cracked under the strain of survival. The night howled with echoes, their shadows chased by torchlight and prayers twisted into curses. Emily whispered fiercely, "We're not their prisoners anymore." She ran as though each stride could break the chains that had bound them since childhood. The sisters stumbled into the clearing, breathless, faces streaked with dirt and tears. The moon cast silver light over the ground, cruelly exposing them. Jonathan emerged, torch blazing, eyes like steel. Jonathan said, "You belong to him." Emily pulled Sarah behind her, trembling but unyielding. Emily said, "We belong to no one." Jonathan's jaw tightened, torn between duty and something unspoken, but he stepped forward. Emily's heart pounded as she braced herself, every fiber screaming to resist. Sarah whispered, "Don't let him take me." Emily clenched her fists, realizing this moment was the break between obedience and freedom, the fight that would decide their fate. Reverend Caleb appeared from the tree line, his robe dragging across the earth like a shadow come alive. His voice thundered, "Defiance is death." Sarah whimpered, pressing into Emily's back. Emily's voice cracked as she said, "Then let it be mine, not hers." Caleb's eyes narrowed, fire burning in his gaze. Jonathan's grip tightened on the torch, uncertainty flashing in his stance. The clearing pulsed with tension, faith against freedom, fear against will. Emily's heart screamed louder than the chants ever had. She whispered, "Tonight, the chains break." The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment the fire of rebellion would ignite. The clearing fell into silence after the confrontation. Emily's body shook, every muscle aching. But she pulled Sarah into her arms and whispered, "We're still alive." The moon hung heavy above, a witness to their rebellion. Behind them, Jonathan lowered his torch, his silence louder than any command. His eyes flickered with something Emily had never seen, doubt. Reverend Caleb's shadow retreated into the forest, his voice fading into the trees like a curse. Emily's tears cut through the dirt on her face, every drop carrying the weight of chains broken but not gone. She said, "The night will never leave us, but neither will our defiance." The sisters stumbled deeper into the woods, the air sharp with pine and damp earth. Sarah whispered, "Will they follow us forever?" Emily held her tighter, replying, "Maybe, but well, keep running." Their bare feet bled with each step, but the pain felt lighter than the weight of obedience. The forest seemed endless, a maze both terrifying and liberating. Emily thought of Ruth, her haunted silence by the well, and wondered if she would ever escape. She said, "Some chains never break, but we can't let them hold us." Each step carried them further from the compound, but closer to the scars that would haunt them for life. At dawn, the sky turned gray, and the trees parted, revealing the edges of a distant town. Emily's chest heaved, but her eyes filled with something new, hope. Sarah said, "Is it really over?" Emily shook her head. "Not over," she said, "but different." The thought of Reverend Caleb's voice still coiled inside her chest, a venom she would never fully spit out. Jonathan's eyes of doubt haunted her too, a reminder that even loyalty could fracture. Emily whispered, "We escaped the walls, not the memories." The town loomed like a promise and a question, and she stepped toward it with trembling feet. In the town, strangers stared as Emily and Sarah stumbled into the streets, dirt and blood staining their clothes. Emily said, "We need help," her voice raw. A woman approached cautiously, her eyes filled with shock and pity. Sarah clung to Emily, whispering, "Don't let them send us back." The woman nodded slowly, guiding them toward shelter. Emily felt the weight of eyes watching, whispering, questioning who they were and what horrors they carried. She thought, "They'll never understand the chains we broke." The sound of Caleb's chants still echoed inside her skull, reminding her that freedom was fragile. That night, in a stranger's home, Emily sat awake while Sarah finally slept in safety. The bed was soft, but her body felt restless, her ears filled with phantom prayers. Emily whispered, "Even free, I hear them." She traced the scars on her palms, memories of gravel and splinters, each one a reminder of the price of survival. She knew Reverend Caleb's shadow would follow her forever, not in flesh but in memory. She kissed Sarah's forehead and said, "You will never kneel again." In the quiet, Emily realized freedom was not peace. It was learning to carry scars and still walk forward. The night settled over the town, quiet but heavy. Emily sat at the window, watching the stars beyond the rooftops. She whispered, "I should feel free." Yet her chest tightened with every echo of Caleb's voice still clawing at her mind. Sarah stirred in her sleep, murmuring the fragments of a prayer, her lips moving with words drilled too deep to forget. Emily's heart cracked as she realized the chains followed them, unseen but unbroken. She said, "They're still inside us." The silence of the room was not peace but waiting, like the pause before a storm. Emily closed her eyes and felt the weight of shadows still reaching across miles. Days later, Emily walked through the market, voices buzzing around her, laughter and bartering foreign in her ears. She touched the fruits on display, the colors too bright after years of gray halls. Sarah clung to her side, eyes darting nervously. Emily said, "It's safe here." But her words felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter. Among the crowd, she caught sight of a figure in a dark robe, only for it to vanish when she blinked. Her breath caught, heart pounding with the thought. Perhaps shadows had followed them. Sarah asked, "Did you see someone?" Emily forced a smile, but the fear rooted itself deeper. That night, Emily dreamed of the compound, of Caleb's voice booming like thunder. In the dream, Jonathan stood over her with torch in hand, but his eyes were hollow, filled with something she couldn't name. She woke drenched in sweat, Sarah's hand resting on hers. Sarah whispered, "It's just a dream." Emily nodded, but the dream left her trembling. She said, "Some dreams never leave." She pressed her palms together and felt the scars from gravel and splinters, her body forever etched with reminders of chains. The chants echoed faintly in her mind, haunting her like ghosts that refused to die. Emily took Sarah to the edge of the river at dawn, the water reflecting pale light. She said, "This is where we begin again." Sarah crouched by the bank, letting the water run through her fingers. Emily closed her eyes, imagining the chants drowned out by the river's rush. Yet the silence inside her was broken by a whisper she could not escape. Caleb's words still stitched into her memory. Emily said softly, "Even in freedom his voice follows." Sarah looked up, her innocence fractured but still clinging to hope. Emily wrapped her arms around her sister, vowing that hope would not be stolen again. That night, Emily sat in silence, Sarah asleep beside her. She whispered, "I hear them chanting in my dreams." Her voice cracked as tears slipped down her cheeks. She looked at Sarah's peaceful face and thought of the hundreds still trapped, their voices lost in endless prayers. Emily said, "We're free, but only 2 of us made it out." The finality of the words sank like stone in her chest. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes, or perhaps only the memory of them. The prayers were never meant to save her, they were meant to silence her. But tonight, her whisper broke through the silence.